Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through scripture for Tuesday, January the 9th. Hopefully, you've seen some iteration of Willy Wonka, whether it was the original and still the greatest Gene Wilder version, or whether it was the latest version with Timothy Chalamet. You're familiar with the story of Willy Wonka. And we remember all of the miscreant kids that were a part of the exploring of the chocolate factory. Charlie Bucket, Veruca Salt, all those people. And one of the scenes in the original Gene Wilder one that they also redid in the weird Johnny Depp one was a scene where they checked out to see good eggs and bad eggs, if you remember. And so there would be these golden eggs that would land. There were chocolate eggs that would land on this thing, and it would weigh whether they were good or whether they were bad, and then the bad ones would be thrown down the chute. If only life was that easy, where you could recognize good fruit and bad fruit. Now, I'm talking about metaphorical fruit. I'm not talking about literal fruit. That's usually pretty easy to find. But when it comes to people, sometimes it can be hard to see what exactly is their fruit. And Jesus warns us in our readings today in Matthew chapter 7 when he says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits." Now, as I was reading this, I was thinking, that's always, we always try to do that. In the church, we talk about what it is to be false prophets. But then I had another question, and it was more of a personal question for myself. How do I know if I'm a bad fruit? And I think that's a really good question, actually, because I think we spend so much time worrying about other people and their fruit that sometimes we forget that we also bear fruit, good fruit and bad fruit. And depending on who you ask, some people might have differing answers. Some people would say, yeah, he has good fruit. And other people go, no, this dude's a bad egg. So the question is then, how can we make sure that the fruit that we are bearing is good fruit? Well, this is the great thing about what Jesus has in his Sermon on the Mount that we're doing here, is in verse 24, he gives us the answer to how we can make sure that we're bearing good fruit. He says, "Everyone who then hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock." That's good fruit. That's good foundation. That no matter what comes, no matter what the wind is like we've experienced yesterday, no matter what comes, we know that we have a firm foundation that then bears good fruit. And that's really our goal, is to make sure that we are standing on the foundation of Christ. And if we're living through those, then we know that regardless of what the world tells us, regardless of what even individuals tell us, we know that ultimately we are going to bear good fruit. That doesn't mean that we're always going to have good fruit. We'll have bad apples every now and then. But it gives us at least a foundation with which to do that. And so we need to make sure and be thinking about what kind of fruit are we bearing. Yes, we need to make sure that we're looking out for the false prophets and the really false biblical teachers, and there's plenty of them. But we need to also make sure that we are the ones that are bearing good fruit. And I love how they finish the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus, in verse 28, he says, when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, not as their scribes. This is a very important little footnote, because it once again is Matthew making the argument of who Jesus is. Remember, the book of Matthew was written to establish Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And so here is Matthew yet again making the point and reminding us that Jesus is exactly who he says he's going to be. Which brings us back to our Genesis reading, because what happens in our Genesis reading this week, or today? The birth of Isaac. This is the start of the promise. This is the beautiful beginning of Isaac. And even when Abraham is tested a couple of chapters later, we see that God is faithful. But it's interesting that in these accountings, we also see Abraham have a moment of bad fruit, if you will. Abraham, the patriarch, the man who is the father of Israel, had his moments when he had bad fruit, and he lied and he was deceitful. We can take solace in the fact that God continued to use Abraham, because the very next story, right after Abraham's lying and deceitfulness, is the birth of Isaac, and God bringing his promise to fruition, regardless of whatever Abraham has done. That's a beautiful thing for us to think about as well. We're going to have times when we don't necessarily bear the fruit that honors God. yet God is going to continue to be faithful because we are his children and he loves us. That's it for today. Hope you have a blessed one. We'll see you tomorrow.